shelter for victims of domestic violence and a new approach to providing care. This morning on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. Earlier this week, staff and supporters of Dane County's Domestic Abuse Intervention Services publicly kicked off a $7 million capital campaign to build a new shelter for domestic abuse victims. Keep that word public in mind. It's important for a number of reasons. Folks gathered at the loading dock of the building that will be the new shelter, the need for which is unquestioned, and you'll hear why this morning, as well as ways you can help get the new facility built. My guests are Shannon Berry, the Executive Director of Domestic Abuse Intervention Services, or DAIS, as you may hear it referred to by the three of us, including City of Madison Police Chief Noble Wray. Shannon, Chief, thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you so much.
Shannon, start by, just helping us get the sort of lay of the land. What is the current state of services for victims of domestic violence, and why was this so needed?
Sure. So DAIS has been around for 35 years. We're celebrating our 35th anniversary this year. We are the primary domestic violence program providing direct services to victims here in Dane County. And we operate a number of different programs, including a crisis line, support groups, legal advocacy services, crisis response services, children's programming, and the only emergency shelter for domestic violence victims in the county. What's very surprising for a lot of people to hear is that our shelter here in Dane County is actually the smallest domestic violence shelter per capita of the entire state of Wisconsin. So the state average is one domestic violence shelter bed per 7,500 people in a service area. Here in Dane County, it's one per 19,000. And so that reality has really forced us to do a lot of things that philosophically we would like to not have to do. So for example, right now we have to screen people for our shelter using a national lethality index, which means that the people who get into our shelter program are literally at risk of being murdered by their batterers. And even with that screening criteria, we are full 100% of the time, and we have wait lists of up to 50 people per night who meet that criteria.
So putting that size of the shelter in perspective, first of all, Dane County is no less prone to have victims of domestic violence than any other county.
Right.
It's not because this is a better county
exactly.
in terms of domestic violence statistics. And second, there's a constant wait list.
There is a constant wait list, yeah, and I think that's a really excellent point. Domestic violence knows no boundaries. It impacts people regardless of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, professional status, socioeconomic status, and I think a lot of people are still really surprised when they hear how prevalent it is, and I'm sure the chief can talk more about what his department sees. I think that it's, Dane County is an amazing place to live. I grew up here in Madison. I can't imagine being anywhere else. And we're so great at so many things, but this is one area where we're severely lacking.
Well, and interestingly, Chief, as Shannon said, people probably recognize law enforcement has made domestic abuse in Dane County a priority for a long time now, and it was one of the leaders nationally in doing that. So there may be this sense that we've got sufficient resources going into that.
Absolutely not. The work that Domestic Abuse Intervention Services is doing, I refer to as homicide prevention. That's how serious it is. And I know I'm here representing the Madison Police Department, but I think I could speak on behalf of all Dane County chiefs that this is a a top priority issue.
And the DA's office.
And the
right?
DA's office. DA Ishmael Ozan has been focused on this for a number of years. He has it as a priority. But let me get back to one thing that Shannon mentioned so I can drill down into this, and maybe some people can really see how important this is. The ability to get shelter services and get the advocates when something has happened really is preventing the escalation. What we've seen in a number of our recent high-profile homicides is domestic violence escalating to the point where there is a homicide. What we'd like to do is intervene earlier on, and that's really important. The other thing that I think the other Dane County chiefs will tell you is that it's still one of our top physical arrests that's going into Dane County. It's really, really important. And then finally, the capacity is important. We need the capacity because if we have the waiting list, you have to ask yourself, well, what's happening to that person when that's going on? And I'm sure Shannon can talk about this a bit more, but I'm talking upstream prevention. You have to think about the number of kids that not only have become victims, but are witnessing this. That's why this is so critical.
So, I mean, in two ways.
Yes.
There's the upstream effect, but then there's the fact that the kids need shelter too.
Absolutely.
Those 25 beds, how many nights are some of them filled by kids?
Half of our shelter residents every year are children, and the majority of them are under the age of 6. You know, and I think that that's a really important point that the chief is making. You know, when I started in this movement a long time ago, I won't say how long ago, that was where I started, was working with children and witnessing the effects that domestic violence has on kids. And kids certainly, I think, who grew up in violent homes where there's domestic violence are at a higher risk for child abuse and neglect themselves. But even witnessing domestic violence can have a huge impact on children. There's a lot of research into brain development of kids who are exposed to trauma. And I think that we see it later on, too, when children become teenagers and how those kinds of things play out. I used to be a social worker in the Madison schools in one of the alternative programs, and a number of the youth that I was working with came from families where there was domestic violence. So it's very interconnected, and there's a great ripple effect throughout the entire community. I think that trauma is often the root cause of a lot of the social problems that we're seeing here in our community.
So Shannon, before we move from the old facility to the new facility, the presence of those kids, the current shelter is a old house, and for as much work as the staff does to make that place as comfortable as possible, it just is worn down and crowded.
It's very chaotic. I mean, we can shelter up to 25 people, as I mentioned, at any given time. That's in 6 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms for 25 people. I often tell people, you know, I share a house with just my husband, and we have 2 bathrooms because I refuse to share a bathroom. And so if you can imagine 25 people coming together in a very communal space, families are having to share bedrooms. And as I mentioned, you know, the families who are staying with us have had severe trauma. So we're asking people to come and stay with us who have had severe trauma, and then to deal with this very chaotic communal living environment. And it's really not conducive to the kind of healing and nurturing space that we know trauma victims need.
Well, no one knows where the old shelter is, and everyone knows as of this week where the new shelter is. So we're going to talk about that when we come back right after this. I am back with Shannon Berry, the Executive Director of DAIS, Domestic Abuse Intervention Services in Dane County, and Madison Police Chief Noble Wray. And we are talking about this week's announcement of the capital campaign, a poorly kept secret.
A very poorly kept secret.
This campaign has been secret for so long, everybody knows it. But no, it was a nice public announcement to build a new shelter for victims of domestic abuse, and it's on Fordham Avenue.
Right.
Okay, so this is a big deal.
It is.
The previous shelter has never, the location is not known. I mean, it was very, very important. Clearly, this had to do with security, the security of the residents. I'm going to start with you, Chief, just from a law enforcement perspective. What is the difference that having a public place can still ensure the safety of the people that are there?
First of all, you know, this has been done in other communities. And in checking, we have not seen that this has been a problem by making a more visible, high-profile shelter. And so we applaud it and we support it. Not only do we applaud it and support it from that standpoint, but part of our struggle, and part of the struggle even with the capital campaign, is making sure that this issue stays out in front of the community. By having it set aside and out of the way where people can't come and can't contribute and can't kick the tires, if you will, and know that it's there and know that it's part of the community, we lose out to some degree. One of our challenges in this is that tomorrow I could have an incident, as most people say, a battery take place on State Street that everybody will know. Well, we have batteries night in and night out that take place in this city in domestic violence situations that go unreported for some very obvious reasons. We don't want to re-traumatize the victim. But this approach, and I applaud Shannon's leadership in shifting gears here and making the shelter a more high-profile way of dealing with domestic violence.
Now, strictly from a tactical perspective, though, Noble, I mean, what will guarantee the police presence, the safety that's necessary? I mean, you've been doing it at the old place, but I assume in a different way.
3 ways. One is that I've already been to the facility, and it is an excellent structure for this. It is sound. The structure is laid out in a manner in which it will be easy to secure it. Then secondarily, we want to make sure that the North District is well aware of its existence and make sure that they know kind of the tactical response to it. Then the third thing that we will do is we'll have our crime prevention officers stop out there and do a security check, a security survey, and make sure that we are doing all of the things that are necessary to keep the people in there safe.
Great point. All right, now, we're not kidding ourselves. When this opens, there's going to be a little added layer of working with victims to tell them. People are going to know, where this facility is.
Absolutely.
But from your perspective, how do you describe the security from?
Sure, certainly. I mean, I think that Noble's comments are absolutely spot on. I mean, this was not a decision that was taken lightly. It was vetted, it was researched, and looked at by a lot of different people before we made the decision to have a public facility. And what we found from our sister organizations across the state who have built public facilities is that they've actually had fewer problems once they've been very public, because the entire community, there's safety in the entire community also being aware of what's going on. So if a batter is hanging around, that neighbors are being cognizant and helping keep an eye out. Certainly the facility, we're working with a security consultant as we're designing it and building it. We've certainly had conversations with Captain McClay on the north side, as well as other responding jurisdictions such as Maple Bluff and those areas, town of Madison. So we've been very conscientious about this. I think the other really important thing and interesting thing for your viewers to know, because this is the biggest question I get about this new facility, is DAIS has a survivor advisory group that we go to and present issues of concern to domestic violence victims and to the people we serve. And they're all people who have used our services in the past. And we brought this question to them. And 100% of them, they unanimously supported the decision. And many of them said, that in the past, their batters had said things to them like, don't bother going to the DAIS shelter because I know where it is anyway. And how they felt incredibly empowered. So they said, if my batter ever said that to me again, I'd say, well, so what? Everybody knows where it is.
Right.
So I thought
including
that was
the cops,
important.
by the way.
Exactly,
Right,
including
right.
the cops. And we do have a really strong partnership with the Madison Police Department and our other law enforcement partners. Anytime we have an issue at our current facility, and one of our staff, all they have to do is pick up the phone and we have a response within, sometimes seconds if they're in the neighborhood. So I think it's really important.
We've talked about this before, and I forget now, Shannon, is it state law that that you cannot tell somebody who's in there without their permission?
That's correct.
Is that state law?
Yes.
And that includes law enforcement, right?
That includes law enforcement.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting point too. So yeah, there's a lot of different Wisconsin statutes that pertain to domestic violence service programs like DAIS, including a non-disclosure statute. And I can't remember the statute number. It's 920
But that's still on the books, and you work around that. You both know how to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it can be frustrating at times. I think for law enforcement, if, for example, an officer brings a victim to the shelter and then comes back the next day to take another statement, it can be challenging, but I think that's why it's so important that we have such a strong collaboration and we communicate so well, because that way officers understand the statutes that we're beholden to, and they know and they have the trust in us that we will do everything within our power to encourage the victim to sign a release so that we can connect her or him back to the officers.
Shannon, this is a big building, double the number of beds, but even beyond that, there's space for other resources.
Right.
What are you going to do that you can't do now?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, we keep talking about the shelter, which is only one of our 7 core programs, and that's the most concrete thing we can talk about. But we will be expanding all of our programming, our support groups, our children's programming, legal advocacy services. Our existing facility, we have 21 full-time staff members and 25 residents, all in a 5,000 square foot building. Everybody shares offices. Some of my staff work in the basement of the shelter. I have 5 staff members crammed into a small office down there. So this will give everybody some breathing room, certainly, but it will give people the privacy and confidentiality that they need.
If anyone wants to help, how can they help?
Well, the first thing they can do is visit our website, which is abuseintervention.org. There's a lot of information there. It's going to take the entire community coming together. This is a big undertaking, and no gift is too small.
It's on the screen actually. So you're $5 million you need, right? You've raised 2.
We've raised about 2.
7 is the goal.
Right.
And so it's going to be that combination yet of big gifts that.
Oh, certainly.
You still
we'll always
welcome
take big gifts, absolutely.
But also small donations
certainly,
are welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to the previous points about the publicity of the shelter itself, I think that really the most exciting thing about this, certainly the building is really exciting, but what to me is the most exciting is that this is really an opportunity for the community to come together collectively and to tell victims, we care about you, and you deserve to have a place that's comfortable and safe for your healing process.
Okay, we'll come back and do this again right around ribbon cutting, okay?
Awesome.
Thank you both very
Great.
much. We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. The $7 million capital campaign for the new Domestic Abuse Intervention Services shelter for victims of domestic violence was announced this past week. Shannon Berry is the executive director of DAIS, and Police Chief Noble Wray joins us this morning. We have a little more time than we thought when I went to the last break. Who's co-chairing the campaign?
We have our 2 honorary co-chairs, who are Lauren and Boo Mortensen. And then Holly Birkenstadt is our chair of our campaign.
Both representing companies that have been very generous philanthropists in this community. The idea of the publicness, I want to get back to that for just a minute, because it intrigues me, the idea of a community taking ownership of an issue.
Right.
And you see it across the country. Cities will want to be known for something. Being known as a city that does not tolerate domestic violence, that takes it seriously, that puts the resources into it, is a big challenge.
It is.
Made more difficult by the privateness of the conversation earlier.
Right.
But is it fair to hope, Shannon, that this is something that we could tackle on a much higher visibility level?
Absolutely.
As a statement that we make.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that domestic violence is still this crime that just really thrives in secrecy. And, the reality is it impacts every single one of us in this community. 1 in 4 women will be the victim of physical or sexual assault at the hands of an intimate partner at some point in her lifetime. And if you compare that to Dane County statistics, that means 63,000 women and girls who live in this county at some point will be a victim of domestic violence. And certainly we serve men too, and the national statistics say about 1 in 10 men. But one of the things that I think the domestic violence movement can learn from the breast cancer movement is, 30 years ago nobody ever talked about breast cancer either, and now everybody talks about breast cancer. You can't go anywhere without seeing a pink ribbon somewhere. Domestic violence impacts twice as many women as breast cancer does, and I think that the domestic violence movement should really follow in the footsteps and the leadership of the breast cancer movement to acknowledge that this issue certainly does impact us all, and that we all know somebody, whether or not they've disclosed to us or not. Every single one of us knows someone who has been impacted by this issue. And frankly, I have to say, and maybe I should knock on wood, I have yet to meet anybody who, when we talk about this issue, says that this doesn't matter.
Right.
And I think that, Dane County is a leader in so many ways. You talked about the law enforcement and the prosecution response to domestic violence. We are known across the state of Wisconsin and nationally for the great criminal justice response that we have to domestic violence. So
and
why not this?
Officers hate those calls, right?
They do.
I mean, they all typically, I've heard them say that they take them very seriously.
Very seriously.
But they're just such difficult
calls. You're dealing with a range of emotions there. You know, a lot of times you have young people, kids involved. Let me see if I can reinforce a point here locally. For the last 10, 15 years, we've averaged 4 to 5 homicides in Madison. 50% of those have been gang-related, roughly. The other half is domestic related. Okay, I don't think people realize that. Now, you know, there's a lot of bravado and hype and discussion around what happens associated with young African American males and gang violence.
Yep.
But we don't get this other part of the domestic violence issue, how important it is that we highlight this and the community embraces as an issue to deal with.
Absolutely. And I think, to just tag on to that point too, I think that that's a really key thing. I mean, so often it feels as though this community doesn't talk about it until there is a homicide. And you know, that's the ultimate form of power and control. But the reality is, for every one of those horrific, traumatic stories that we hear about on the news where someone's life has been taken by domestic violence, there are literally thousands of others who are living in fear every single day in their homes.
Which leads to a whole nother show, I suspect, on alcohol and drugs, and what becomes of the abuser.
Right.
You know, what treatment's available for the abuser. I mean, I know that that's something that you're working on.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not just focusing on the victims. It's also focusing on what the abusers are doing and making sure that they're acknowledging that there are some issues that they have to address, not just from kind of a zero tolerance arrest approach for their conduct and their behavior, but there are some things in terms of, you know, alternative to aggressions. There are a whole host of things that we try and work on with abusers.
And younger men all the time, high school, college age. Yes. Right?
Absolutely. You see it, you know, sometimes you'll hear about fights that take place in the high schools, and sometimes we will assume that it's, you know, either gang or just kind of a violent thing. But when you drill down and you go underneath it, there are overtones of domestic violence-related relationships that are there, and there has been a local response to trying to address that at the high school level.
Are we making any progress, Shannon? I mean, it's a hard question, but it just feels like as much as we try.
Well, it's one of those hard questions because I think making progress in this issue means that more people are going to reach out for help. You know what I mean? So in some cases, you know, long term, obviously we want domestic violence to end, but in the short and immediate term, success is getting more people to come out and talk about what's happening to them and to reach out for help. So, you know, when I see more people calling our crisis line, in some ways that's a measure of success for me because I know that those victims are picking up the phone and maybe they've never done that before. So I do think that we're seeing progress, and I do think that as a community we certainly are talking about this more than we were 5 years ago.
That would suggest that as the numbers need to go up before they will come down.
Exactly.
And that the fact that they are going up means that they will come down.
Right, exactly, absolutely.
Okay. Break ground, you hope,
that's a great question.
14? No, you want to open in 14,
we would love
don't you?
to open in 2014.
Yep.
You know, it's a $7 million campaign, which is certainly very ambitious. As you mentioned, we have about $2 million, a little bit more, raised or pledged, and we'd like to have about 75% pledged before we break ground. Once we break ground, it'll be a very fast construction process.
Congratulations on getting this far.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll come back and wrap up right after this. My thanks to Chief Wray and Shannon Berry for being here this morning. A programming note, tune in next Sunday starting at 10 a.m. for a debate among the 4 2nd Congressional District candidates. I'll be moderating that debate among the candidates looking to fill the seat vacated by Tammy Baldwin. For the Record will be back in 2 weeks with guest UW Athletic Director Barry Alvarez. Thanks for watching.